Welcome to the History Nerd United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Returning to the podcast, Margalit Fox. If you listen to the first episode with Margot, you know she brings it. It's super easy to interview her. I just ask the question and just let her regale us. Today she's talking about her new book, The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, Old-Timey Organized Crime. Need I say more? I don't think so. Quick programming note for those of you who know, it is hot as heck on the East Coast. Margot needed to have a fan on while we were chatting just to not die of heat stroke. So if you hear a little hum in the background or anything like that, don't worry, nothing is broken. We just needed to make sure that Margot could make it through the interview. She's a real trooper. Now I'm going to shut up. And here we have returning to the podcast, Margalit Fox, the talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, Rise and Fall of an American Organized Crime Boss. Margot, so great to have you back.
Thank you for having me again.
Margot, I've read multiple of your books. I want to get this right off my chest right away. I was reading this and I could feel this is the most fun you've had writing a book. Was I feeling the wrong thing? Was I reading too much into it? But it's palpable in this book how much fun you're having.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to hear that because after all, how often does one get the privilege of writing about a big, zoftig, nice, synagogue-going Jewish mother of four who was also a major organized crime boss? So, yeah, given how long ago the story took place and how nonviolent her brand of organized crime was, I could have a lot of fun.
Now, when did you first hear of Fredericka Mandelbaum? I'm going to call her Marm. I love calling her Marm, so I'm going to do that for the rest of this. But how did you first learn about Fredericka?
Everybody else called her Marm, including criminals and the press, so have at it. Marm Mandelbaum was, in a sense, always there for the taking, but like so many women in history, she existed kind of sub rosa, but she'd throw off these little sparks from time to time in the literature. The canonical example is that she makes several cameo appearances in Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York. And a great many books on New York in the 19th century, particularly on historical crime, name check her. They might have a paragraph or two about her, but there were very few full-length treatments of her life and work. And so once I started to be aware of her, two questions really seized hold of me. One, who was this extraordinary woman? And two, how on earth was she, as a woman, able to rise to become the head of the most notorious crime syndicate in America?
Now, from a technical perspective, it's got to be hard to write about somebody like Marm because you don't have like huge sections of dialogue in here. She, of course, wouldn't want to be in the press like that. She wouldn't want to put her words actually out there because that would be a horrible criminal. So from a technical perspective as an author, was it fun to kind of have to piece this life together in, a different way than you would just a general biography where everything is there for the taking?
Well, you put your finger right on it. And of course, anyone writing historical nonfiction, whether it's true crime or something else, your first order of business is to look for personal papers. In this case, there were none, at least none that anyone has ever been able to find. And I think the reason is that Mrs. Mandelbaum was no fool. She clearly knew that in her line of work, committing anything to paper would have been professional suicide. So then, as a journalist, where do you go? So I assembled her life over more than a year from all of these little glimmers and sparks. I felt like a 19th century prospector panning for gold, appropriately, since that dovetails completely with her era in America. And so there were hundreds and hundreds of period newspaper articles that I made my way through. Some were, nice, clean, digitized copies online. Others were on microfilm. Remember microfilm from the school library? Microfilm that was so old, parts of it were black with decay. It looked as though things had been redacted. There were also wonderful things in the New York City Municipal Archives, court records. In this era when so many people are getting indicted, it was a thrill to find her original indictment papers, and we even have a copy of one page of the indictment in the book. There were also, happily, memoirs by her colleagues and contemporaries on both sides of the law, criminals and the police alike. And so she could be pieced together as a kind of mosaic. And I'm hoping that in the end she emerged fully formed.
Now, how does she even get to this point in history where she can be a crime boss? Where does she originally come from? Kind of what's her family upbringing? Who is she before she becomes this fully formed, let's say, crook? Why not?
Why not indeed? Call a crook a crook. Although, of course, in the end, she was much more. She was a master criminal receiver, a.k.a. offense, who eventually came to command an army of housebreakers, shoplifters, and even bank burglars that extended throughout the United States. But her origins were very, very different from that. Fredericka Mandelbaum was born in 1925 and grew up in Kassel in what is now Germany. Her people were poor village Jews. They had been small traders and peddlers for generations. Jewish life in the region was extremely difficult. Jews were under restrictions as to the trades they could ply. Peddling was one of the few that was allowed. They were restricted as to where they could live, which by extension restricted whom they could meet and whom they could marry. They were sometimes subject to violence by their Gentile neighbors. That was not unknown. And the region as a whole, in this period when Fredericka was a young woman, was beset by an economic depression and, like Ireland, by a potato famine. So in 1850, 25-year-old Fredericka, her husband Wolf, who was a poor peddler, and their infant daughter Bertha joined thousands of other immigrants from the region, Jews and Gentiles alike, and came to New York in steerage, 6 weeks or more under sail, in cramped, dark, dirty, malodorous, unhygienic conditions, in search of a better life here.
So this is a woman who shows up on the shores of the U.S. She's already a survivor. She's in her 20s. She's already married. She's already a survivor. She's prepped to just figure out how to live in the city, because New York City is not a wonderful place to live at this point in time, is it?
Certainly not where they and immigrants like them had to live. They settled on the Lower East Side in a region that would soon be called Klein-Deutschland, Little Germany. It was one of America's first important ethnic enclaves. And the good part of that was they could speak German all day. They could sing and dance in German-style beer halls, watch German folk parades, and German Jews and Gentiles alike lived there. The bad side was they were in tenement poverty. They lived at several addresses in the region during their first decade in New York, typically in conditions of great crowding, 20 or more families stuffed into a very small, flimsy apartment building, no indoor plumbing. You hauled your water up the stairs from a street pump. The outhouses in the back that were shared by everybody weren't hooked up to any city sewer system, so backyards overflowed with raw sewage. The streets were filled with garbage snapped at by bands of loose pigs. Workmen's cart horses would drop in the street from overwork, and their carcasses swarm with flies. Houses were hard by industrial facilities like factories, even slaughterhouses. They were really deplorable conditions, and tragically for the young Mandelbaum family, in those unhygienic, crowded conditions, communicable diseases like typhoid, cholera, consumption ran through the tenement community like brush fires, and their infant daughter, Bertha, is hauntingly absent from the next census. It is quite clear that she succumbed to one such disease. So there Fredericka is living in tenement poverty. She's lost a child. It is very clear that she was determined to do whatever it took not to remain in poverty and to provide for her family. She would go on to have 4 more children.
Speaking of deplorable, you're talking about New York City at this time. You are a journalist. As a historian, it's almost darkly hilarious how blatantly anti-Semitic the newspapers are at this time. It's just words that, of course, nowadays we would never see them in the newspapers, but these are headlines. Anti-Semitism is just rampant. Marm's going to run into that. When you look back, is it still shocking, or are you just kind of used to this is how it used to be and this is what it was?
This is how it used to be, and this is how it is again. That perhaps is another conversation, but it's something very urgent to keep in mind, that the xenophobia, anti-Semitism, backlash against women, misogyny of that time are still mirrored in our own time. So it's very important that we all be mindful of that history. Past, unfortunately, is very much present in this case. But yes, newspapers had casual knee-jerk anti-Semitism that certainly in the mainstream press would be unheard of and considered appalling today. Mrs. Mandelbaum, as she grew more notorious, was widely covered by newspapers and magazines. She was the subject of editorial cartoons. She even had characters based on her in 2 stage plays of the period that we know of. And yes, many of the depictions used anti-Semitic slurs freely, or she was drawn in blatantly anti-Semitic caricature. There's no gainsaying that.
Now, does she have any sort of legal work before she jumps into this crime? How does she really get started and then drawn in or walks into the fencing racket?
When she and her husband arrived in New York, Wolf resumed his work as a peddler, a trade plied by many of the city's German Jews, and Fredericka, too, began her working life in this country as a peddler, selling lace door to door. But street peddling, then and now, is well known to be the bottom level of economic activity. As she was no fool, she would have known immediately that to remain a peddler for her life would have been to ensure she remained in poverty. What we know is by the end of her first decade in New York, circa 1859, she had already apprenticed herself to 2 master fencers who were working in and around that Klein-Deutschland community, 2 older Jewish men who taught her the business. They taught her the wholesale value of all sorts of luxury goods like silk yardage, lace, sealskin, that the emerging middle class was being conditioned by the media to crave, but did not want to pay full price for. And that was how she learned the business. By about 1859, she had forsaken peddling and gone into business as a solo entrepreneur, receiving goods of, let us say, dubious provenance from street scavengers and small-time thieves and pickpockets. She asked no questions. She disguised the merchandise if need be, so its origin could less readily be traced, and she sold the swag onward at a profit. So Fredericka Mandelbaum had become a fence.
There were a lot of amazing facts in here, and some conjecture too, because you have to. One of the things, and especially anybody who's listening right now, you might be jumping to, oh, well, the husband has something to do with it. But all indications are he had nothing to do with this. This was all Marm all the time. He was just kind of in the dark.
That's right. I think it was sort of a don't ask, don't tell situation between the 2 of them. Obviously, he knew his wife was bringing in increasingly good money, but by every account, her husband, Wolf, was uninvolved in her early foray into fencing, just as he would be uninvolved in the long, increasingly lucrative criminal enterprise that followed. He died in 1875, and then as a widow, Marm continued doing her thing. There's a wonderful quote from George Washington Walling, who was the police chief during the years of Marm's rise. And he said, the woman took the lead in these nefarious transactions. She was a thorough businesswoman. Her husband was a non-entity.
A lot of history, I'll read books nowadays where someone says, oh, this person is so amazing, and I found these new documents and sources, and this person was kind of a huge deal. But especially for people who haven't heard of her, you kind of already mentioned it, but I want to talk about a very specific instance. She was basically in a play, The Two Orphans. There's a woman who is based on her in it. She actually goes to see it and is not appreciative of how she is put on the stage. But it just kind of goes back to that she was well known. This was not somebody who, hey, you found her and you found her interesting and you're making her bigger than she was. Her name was a very well-known name, so that if you saw somebody up on the stage, you can say, oh, that's a different name, but that's Marm up there.
Absolutely. She was literally world famous. And remember, this before radio and television. She died in 1894. But as she rose in prominence and wealth, and she was able, because New York was a wide open town in those Tammany years, she was able to ply her illicit trade almost entirely in the open. And so the press wrote about the lavish private apartments that she had for her family above the modest haberdashery shop on the Lower East Side, which was the front for her real business. They wrote about the exorbitant dinner parties she gave in her apartments, as coveted as anything Mrs. Astor would have given uptown. They wrote about her vast silk gowns. They wrote about all the diamonds she wore. And these are not just the New York papers. I found clippings about her in the Cincinnati papers, the Atlanta papers, farther and farther west. And when she died in 1894, her death was covered as far away as London. So she was big news.
And not only as a fence, but I think you can also call her a bit of an investor. And by investor, I mean she was financing burglaries and bank robberies. So with Marm and all of that, are you able to even really, you can kind of connect her, but there still has to be a bit of conjecture because she was good at even kind of hiding her footprints of, you know that she's associated with certain people doing these robbery or burglaries, but she's probably behind it somewhere, right?
Well, I was very careful only to talk about the burglaries and robberies where there was clear documentation in the press that she was behind it. Conjecture, of course, is the downfall of the historical nonfiction writer. So I trust that I was careful not to stray into that territory. What fascinated me is when I first started researching Marm, I knew, of course, this was a work of historical true crime. I knew it was a piece of forgotten women's history. But what I didn't fully get until I was a few months into the research was this is a business story. Because Marm Mandelbaum, who would have been in the old country educated at home or at a Jewish day school for girls, but she obviously didn't have a college education. She didn't have a business degree, but she was so smart and had such a genius for putting her finger to the wind and seeing what it was the culture and this emerging bourgeois class wanted to buy at deep discount and giving it to them. So she made herself into what one historian so wonderfully calls a mogul of illegitimate capitalism, because she took the formerly desystematized, scattershot, kind of ad hoc pastime that was property crime and turned it into a well-oiled, streamlined, scalable business. And I am not aware that anyone did that so deeply and in such a sustained way as she. She ran that business for 25 years until her eventual arrest in 1884.
You're getting so deep into this history with some pretty cool stuff. Did you ever think about taking up burglaries just around New York City, just to see how it feels so you can really immerse yourself into the history?
Did I? Probably not the best idea unless you plan to bake me a cake with a file in it. I did have the fantasy of seeing whether we could hold the launch party for the book at Tiffany and Company, because there is a section in the book on how Marm Mandelbaum personally scoped out and then had two of her foot soldiers rob Tiffany and Company. But I kind of thought they might not go for that idea.
Something else just to kind of prove how huge she was. The people that she has working for her for, these burglaries that we're talking about, these are some of the best of the time. This is not smash and grab type situations. This is something you would see in Heat with Robert De Niro in it, only back in the day, right? She has some real muscle both in the physical and mental sense.
That's right. These were crooks who were some of the foremost freelance criminals of the day. My original training was as a cellist, and it's as if she started a symphony orchestra and said, let me recruit Itzhak Perlman and Yo-Yo Ma to be on salary and play in my orchestra. They'll give up their solo careers and just work for me. And that is what she did with the foremost bank burglars and jewel thieves of the day. It really was an organization that she ran. For a time, she put some of her best thieves on salary. She would take care of them in every conceivable way, from this motherly whining and dining of them at her groaning table. She would call her foot soldiers my chicks. That's why the press started calling her Mother or Marm Mandelbaum. She would, of course, bail them out when they got arrested. She would advance them money if they found themselves in some far-off city in straitened circumstances. And my favorite thing, just because it sounds so charming from our 21st century perspective, she would supply getaway horses and carriages for their robberies. And what else were you going to supply them with? It was 1860s, 1870s. But it sounds so quaint to us. You've just knocked over a bank. Quick, you have to elude the police. So you climb into your carriage and you go genteelly clippity-clopping down the street, kind of the original white Bronco chase. But she gave her cohort of employees all of these things.
All right, robbers, thieves, crooked cops. However, I think in the book, the two most crooked people in the book are her lawyers. This is over the top. Honestly, this is that part of nonfiction where I'm sitting there going, I trust that these two people are not made up, because you would never do that. But man, does it stretch your belief in people that she has two of the most crooked lawyers I've ever heard of.
I know, and because it is so long ago, it's well over a century ago, I felt I was well within my rights to say they were two of the most deliciously crooked lawyers American jurisprudence has ever known. And this is the Lower Manhattan firm of Howe and Hummel, whom Marm Mandelbaum had on a $5,000 annual retainer for years, and that would be well over $100,000 in today's money. She esteemed their work so much, they got her out of all kinds of jams, and they represented a lot of her foot soldiers. They pretty much represented the entire New York underworld, from loan sharks to madams of bordellos, to fences like Fredericka Mandelbaum, to all kinds of thieves, and, a nice complement of murders and arsonists. One of the things that delighted me most about Howe and Hummel is they would not take personal checks. Why? Because so many of their clients were the country's most skilled forgers and counterfeiters. They are an absolute delight, and as I said, if they hadn't existed in real life, Damon Runyon would have had to have invented them.
I know you have sources. Find somebody in TV, and I need you to pitch Law and Order 1800s. And we got to get people like this on the TV, because I just got to see it.
Absolutely. And what's so wonderful about the firm of Howe and Hummel, they were so famous in their day, and they would stop at nothing to get their clients acquitted. And stopping at nothing meant, routine activities like suborning perjury, bribing witnesses, bribing judges, possibly bribing jurors. And, spiriting clients in and out of the jurisdiction as needed, recruiting actors to sit in the gallery and weep as an accused murderer's loving wife, and recruiting actors to be his adoring children, frail white-haired mother. They were so famous in their day that a standard drinking man's toast, when you'd raise your glass and you'd say, "Here's how," would invariably be followed by, "Here's Hummel."
Now, I felt like, as I'm reading this, that you really started to like Marm. There was something about her that was magnetic to you. And listen, we've talked about how she's a criminal, and I don't want to get too far into what happens towards the end. I want everybody to read that. But there was positive aspects to her. I mean, more than just the fact that this is a woman doing something that a lot of men couldn't even do. But there were positive aspects to her, especially kind of as a mother, right?
Right. Look, we cannot gainsay or overlook the fact that she was a career criminal, and she made her living, a damn good living, by stealing other people's stuff. What heartened me, not only because so much time has passed, I felt I could tell her story in a fairly relaxed way, but her brand of organized crime was almost completely nonviolent. Here's the thing. When we think of organized crime and a crime boss, we think either of Tony Soprano, or if you're older, you think of Bruce Gordon playing Frank Nitti on Untouchables, a big guy in Prohibition with spats and a Tommy gun. All of that stuff came later, in the very late 19th and early 20th century, when the boys moved in to run organized crime. Fredericka Mandelbaum was only interested in property crime. She robbed from the rich and gave, or rather sold at below wholesale, to the emerging middle class. There was one tragic incident that is discussed in the book at some length, where a bank burglary under her auspices went horribly wrong and resulted in a death. But that was literally the only instance I could find in her 25-year career where anyone got hurt or killed. She wasn't having people whacked. She wasn't breaking people's kneecaps. That came later.
Now, Margo, if I could send you back in time so you could interview one person from your book, I'm going to take Marm off the table. Marm is too easy. If I could send you back and you could interview one person from the book, who would it be?
See, when you sent me that question, you didn't say you were going to take Marm off the table. So
I want to keep you tap dancing.
Of course, it would have been Marm. But absent Marm, whom would I interview? I think there's a wonderful old saying that goes something like, "He who would sup with the devil had best bring a long spoon." I think I would have loved to have had supper in some fancy club with Howe and Hummel, but boy, would I have brought a long spoon to keep me safely away from them.
Now, do you have a favorite crime that Marm was involved in? You don't have to give us all the details, but just to whet the appetite a little bit.
Well, I think it is actually the Tiffany's robbery. She did much more lucrative and much larger scale robberies later, where, on many a time she would have an entire bank knocked off by her crew of men. But Tiffany's, which was quite early in her career, was elegantly done. She went in all her finery and scoped out the joint, saw where the staff was, how people came and went, and most importantly, what the counter with trays of loose diamonds was like. And I will say only that it took only two of her employees, one very well-dressed man and one very well-dressed woman, and crucially, one of them had a piece of gum, a piece of chewed gum. And with that, you too can rob Tiffany's, provided you're living in the 19th century.
Yes, do not try and rob Tiffany's right now with gum. We do not support that at all. It's not allowed.
Correct.
All right, Margo, you know what I always end with? You've already answered it, but I'm going to let you answer it again. People think history is boring. There's nothing in this for me. Why would I want to read history? I put one of those poor misguided souls in front of you, and they say, why should I read this? Margo, what are you going to say?
Well, I can't imagine anyone listening to your podcast would feel that way, but if we have the misfortune to run into one such person. I guess really, I mean, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I guess I have two choices. One is simply to kick him down the stairs, which is very seductive. But two, if I can summon a modicum of restraint, I would say the past is present. The past itself is much more nuanced and much more bifurcated than we were generally taught in school. Marm made her ascent at the start of what is called the Gilded Age. So uptown, you had titans of industry like Vanderbilts, Astors, Rockefellers, building these rococo mansions, lined with gold and silk and old master paintings. Downtown, you had people of Marm's cohort, much less fortunate and less business savvy than she, living in tenement poverty. It's important to remember that that too was the dark, rarely seen underside of the Gilded Age. But what in the end separates those uptown titans of industry from the successful underworld figures? Because the uptown guys were called robber barons for a reason. They made their fortunes through, among other things, breaking up strikes, often fatally, cornering markets, engineering hostile takeovers, and doing all sorts of things that, because they were in the so-called upper world, the world of legit commerce, didn't happen to be considered illegal. So what I would leave my inquisitor, whom I have spared being kicked down the stairs with, is this. There's a wonderful quote from Bertolt Brecht, which translates very loosely as, which is the greater crime, to rob a bank or to found one?
Well, Margot, I love the book. Thank you so much for coming to talk about it, and I can't wait for the next one to come out so you can have you back again.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Margaret, thank you so much for coming on, the talented Mrs. Mandelbaum. Go out and get it, folks. Hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Check out YouTube. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.